So now we've kind of gone over some techniques for a shared data set. This is important now if we want to connect other things such as Excel. So one thing that I don't like is, when you have that more options, export to Excel, it doesn't look good. It comes in a different format. Usually if you have a matrix, it's going to flatten it out. Not really very helpful. What I like to do is, depending on the purpose, we might want to have more control. We might want to have predefined kind of Excel sheets set up, connected to our model live. And there's a few advantages on using Analyze in Excel. So I'm going to click on my model. If no one's used Analyze in Excel, I'd recommend checking it out. It's quite easy to set up. So if you're in, this is with the new look on, we just click on the ellipsis here. And there's this Analyze in Excel button. Clicking that, it's going to download this ODC connection. This is just a connection file which tells you how to connect the metadata for the connection. So I'm going to open this. If it prompts you to open, ask which program, I'm going to say Excel. So what I've done is now I've downloaded Analyze in Excel file from my model file. The file it downloads is essentially just a bit of code, a bit of metadata with the connection strings to that model. Once I open this in Excel, it's going to, I'm going to enable. It's going to open up a pivot table. Now you'll notice in the pivot table, I have multiple different fields here. So this is an Olap pivot table. A lot more powerful than just a standard pivot from one table. We have here different tables, and these are related. This is the same tables as I have in my data model here. So we can start now building our own Excel files from the model directly connected to Power BI model. Something you will have to be signed in. So you'll sign in and connect. The advantage of this is it adheres to row level security. So if you have row level security, you're going to authenticate and it's going to pull through as it's pulled off the same model. So I'm going to just, for example, I'm going to look at symbols and I'm going to have my stock price. So these are just pulled off a blog on PowerBI.Tips on how to pull stock prices into models directly. What this is doing is this is live connected to my data. So as my data refreshes, I can refresh this and I can have this model live connected. You will notice these tables act slightly differently in the fact that in the table in the fields on the right, we have kind of the epsilon symbol and then data symbols. You can only use explicit measures in the values section of an Olap table. So if you, unlike Power BI, where you can drag in a numeric field into the values, you cannot do that in Excel. So if you want to use this method, you will have to create explicit measures of what you're trying to see. So say you normally bring in the price and you just automatically in Power BI have it as sum. You will have to explicitly write a measure to say sum of price. This is probably a recommended way anyway. I would do that and then hide the original column. That way, it's a good way of controlling how people can connect and just, making sure that they're using the correct aggregations. Because sometimes people can drag something in if they're a report builder. They might set it to an average or they might set it to the min or max. So this is probably a good strategy anyway, to have any numerical value that isn't an ID in your column hidden, and then write measures off that so that we explicitly state what the measure should be. So again, we can add, date. Now, what I do like about Excel, it is a lot better probably for users who are used to Excel. we still get all the advantages of having this live connected to our model. This is going to be connected. This is when they open it. It's going to refresh the data. It's going to be up to date with your data as you refresh. You also have the option to go data refresh all. This is useful if you want to still use, say you use a lot of VBA macros. I've written a few where we have VBA macros on the Excel file. We can save these Excel files and send them out and have people open them. And this will still use the live data. They'll connect. They'll be authenticated through logging in, and the security will still apply, which is a big part of using this. One thing you will notice if you do try and save this to SharePoint or something like that, you cannot live connect to the data when you're viewing this online. You will have to download it to a machine. So if you use OneDrive, you can sync the OneDrive to your machine and open it directly. Which, again, if you're using VBA or something, you have a reason to use Excel, you'll probably do that anyway.
Finance teams love this.
Yes.
This is a huge finance team win because you have all the data, you need all the numbers, and they just want it back in Excel. I get you, dude. We got to make a model. Let me give you a great model, and you can go to town with it and build your Excel things here as well. This
can kind of help adoption. You can give your users the same familiarity they're used to, still maintaining control over the measures. We're not having people create all their own Excel files, emailing files around, have 100 different sources of the truth. The other thing is now, a lot of times when people are doing that, they're having tons of VLOOKUPs into different files. We have a model in this file. You don't need to do VLOOKUPs because the relationships and the tables are already related. You can just drag things in and it works because we've done that. The IT or whoever is in charge of that has done before. They've written the measures and they've done the logic. This opens up kind of, those people who still like Excel, who are hard to get on board with a Power BI, as it does face change. Power BI is a new product. A lot of people are hesitant to change. I think probably most of this group would agree it's very powerful, but it can be difficult to get new products in there and to have that adoption. So this is one way you can do that. If you are using Excel, I would recommend to go and search for the Olap pivot table extensions. This is on GitHub. It's a free download and it gives you some extra tools specifically for Olap pivot tables, as you can imagine. This is an add-on to Excel. I won't go too in depth because it can do a lot. One thing, if you right click on an Olap pivot table, we have down here Olap pivot table extensions. This is an awesome tool. You can see a lot of kind of the metadata about your pivot table. This is if you really want to get into the weeds on how to make these faster, how to get better pivot tables. One thing I quite like is it actually uses an MDX query on your cube, and it tells you the query here. This has been really, really useful for me when I've had to debug slow performing pivot tables. So especially if you know MDX, I don't, so it was a bit, of a learning curve.
Nobody knows.
No. It also gives you a bit of, if you're interested, if you really like getting into the weeds, it gives you a bit of kind of insight into how these pivot tables work. Because here it uses a cross join of kind of your dimensions and adds the measures in. So a great tool. It's got some other ones. If you are interested, go and it's got the documentation on the GitHub and play with that. Again, you have the ability to use standard pivot table slicers. So I can insert a slicer by pivot table analyze, insert slicer, just like you would a normal pivot table. This is, I'm going to say, let's look at, so these are stock prices. I just picked the biggest 50 of the New York Stock Exchange, and I pulled 10 years of monthly data.
If you follow people who do Excel things, you can do some pretty incredible stuff with like fancy slicers. There's actually a really interesting date range slicer that you can do as well, where you get like a start and end date as well. So you can really go to town on some of the stuff still back in Excel.
The slicer works, just like with a normal slicer. We can select different things. It's going to slice our data. And this is really nice because this is now live data, or, as live as our model is. Pretty useful here. A couple of things with the slicers. If you are using like really heavy DAX and there's complicated measures, or you're using lots of measures, lots of slices, there's a few things you can do just as a general housekeeping to try and make things faster. One thing is if I add another slicer. So I'm going to add insert slicer. I'm going to add, so I've got an industry and a sector. So there's a few different things. I've selected an industry. So auto manufacturing is part of the capital goods sector. You'll notice it's kind of grayed out, these other ones, because it's saying there's no data for this. This is kind of like in Power BI when we use the edit interactions between two different filters. Sometimes this is great. Sometimes it can slow down a report. Just an Excel thing, especially when you're using this live connect. What actually happens is that every time you interact with this pivot table, such as apply a slicer, it's going to send off a query for the data in the range. So that includes if I collapse kind of rows, it's going to send off a query just for the view that we have. Once I apply a slicer, it's going to send off a query. If we're using a lot of DAX, it can take time if we're really overwhelming it. So one thing, if you right click on a slicer, I found this can probably the biggest impact I've seen on speed if you're using a lot of slicers and reports. Slicer settings. This is what's controlling the grayed out. So we're saying visually indicate items with no data, this gray color here, freestyling arrow, and then show items with no data last. Obviously, this is very useful. It can significantly slow things down. You have an option to hide, which if I hide the data, it's just going to completely hide it. If possible, you can have it on. I would say if you are experiencing, you can untick these if it's being very slow. Obviously, now there is a disadvantage on that. You don't know that this industry is actually only one of these, so I could select 2, which is going to return no data, because this slicer doesn't indicate that there's no items in this slicer. Check your report. This is the #1 cause I found when using slicers for slow reports. The other thing you can do is if you have multiple pivot tables in the same report, you can have report connections, and you can tick and untick the report connections. So you can have your one slicer if you wanted a ton of different views to affect different pivot tables, kind of like a sync slicer in Power BI. Good way, kind of very useful because you don't want people to select the same slicer on every single page. So here's one I did earlier. Somewhere.
Steve and I have been working on this for a while, and I've been begging him to you gotta tell people about what this stuff is. Because Steve's been doing a lot of work around this part of Power BI and model building, and there's so many. This is huge. I can't underestimate how amazing this stuff is when you're getting back into Excel. It is a common story.
Excited.
It's exciting. Everything's happening on. But it's a common model that everyone can consume.
So here's one advantage I like on pre-setting up these reports is that you can make them look a lot better. When you just use that ellipsis, export this data to Excel, it gives you this awfully horrible kind of table, which is flattened, has one line of all your slices in a row. Now we're live connected. So this is a cash flow statement of our example organization, which happens to be similar to Microsoft's cash flow statement. Sure. We have our slicer here. We can have income. You'll notice here, if you watch kind of in this, watch down here. As I select my slicer, you'll notice it says running Olap query. Might be kind of quick. This is when I explained this is sending queries off directly live to your cube. This is a live connect, right? The same as our Power BI model. This is up-to-date data. We're sending those queries off. It doesn't download all the data previously into your Excel file. If you have a huge model, it's not going to make a difference if you have the same amount of data in your Excel file than a small model, because it just sends off a query to return whatever data here. So it's efficient in that way. Does mean every change you make, it is going to send that query off. So you have to write efficient DAX, make sure you're not overly complicating your DAX, make sure you have well-designed models, kind of standard 101 model design. And then again, you can have multiple different tabs in here, and we can just have a.
Still a thing.
Sorry?
Is Power View still a thing?
It was an add-in. I don't think it doesn't come with the product. I think you will get it and download it, but I don't think you would want to at this point.
I think it was also kind of designed as a Power BI test type. Yeah.
Power BI thing.
That was how Power BI was initially started.
Yeah.
It started in Excel.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was
SharePoint.
Well, it started in SharePoint for a while. SharePoint BI, that was part of it, and then the Excel team was like, well, we already have a great BI tool. We should add visualizations to it, like this. And so they made Power View, which was like the very cursor of it. And they said, no, this is not going to work. And they broke the product team in two pieces. They said, Excel, you keep doing Excel. Power View actually came out and formed Power BI Designer, which was the original Power BI Desktop. And then, like within a year, they renamed it to Power BI Desktop. And there's where we are.
You're missing the first Power BI service, which was SharePoint,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
Like the tiles.
Yeah, the tiles.
SharePoint.
So a question, Steve.
Mhm.
If you have them listed as they're out of order alphabetically, you have them in there. Are you able to
In this
pivot
order.
tables? Can you drag and drop things around like you normally would?
So in this pivot table, I've actually in my model, I've ordered this in the way of a cash flow statement. So this is directly from my model. If I go to pivot table options, I believe, put me on the spot.
This is probably my biggest pet peeve of people who like to use Power BI for finance, because they want it to look like the financial statement. It's got to be in a certain order, and it's not alphabetical. It's all kinds of other stuff. So you have to do stuff to it so that it can fit in a format that is the financial statements.
Use convert to formulas. That's a good way to do that.
You can also
It's not that big.
Yep, you can
can.
make it static.
Yeah, we'll go into that. That's a great point. Right now, this is in the order that I had it in. So there is just some drawbacks kind of or limitations, I'll say. You don't get quite as much as controlled as if this was just free data in Excel, which is also kind of the point. We are kind of limiting that. We're saying this is the measures we're using. This is what we're looking at. To go to that point, there are some specific formulas you can use, just like you would in Excel. Just if I go to my data tab here, I'm going to hit data. I'm going to go to my queries and connections. This is going to open up my queries and connections pane. And you can see I have one connection, and this is the connection. It's called it the data set. I'm just going to right click and go into the properties. Essentially, when I first downloaded the file, it was the Excel file model.odc. This is pretty much what that file is. It's this connection telling me what I'm connected to. I won't go too much into it, but we have the initial catalog, which is our server, the analysis services server, and the data source here, which is our database. We can also change this to these values if we want to connect this directly to our model. So it's labeled a little bit differently, but there's a few other options in here. I'll make this a little bigger. Again, this is quite interesting to read. Data source here. This This is my database. This is just how it comes through in this ODC connection. Initial catalog here. This is my server. If you're interested in this, I encourage you to play about. We can change these to different models if you wanted to change the connection for some reason, or you can connect this to a local file, just like we did with the Power BI. You get a ton of other kind of options which aren't really important here. So this is our connection. We can use special Excel formulas, which I think is really cool, to actually return measures directly from our model. So I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to create some space. So when we write some Excel formulas, you'll notice we have these cube formulas. These are cube formulas because this is referring to an analysis services cube that we've published. This is what we mean by the model. This is a cube file online. There's a few which you can research, but the one I'm going to look at now is cube value. You see it returns an aggregated value from the cube. It asks me for the connection. This is this connection to the right here, the PBI Azure. So you have to use quotations. As soon as I put a quotation in, it's going to prompt me and tell me this is my cube. You can see we have a cube, so we know this is what we're doing. You have a little cube here. This means what connection do you want? So I'm just going to tab connect to that. Then we can have a whole bunch of options. The first one I want to say is kind of what I want to return. So once I do my quotations again, it's going to think. Ooh, I scrolled. And it's going to load everything I can have. I want to return a measure. It puts everything in measures here. I'm going to say measures. These are all of my measures in the model. I'm going to put a parentheses. And now it's giving me which measure I want to select. So I can say stock price. And I've scrolled over. So if I click enter here, it's just getting data. Now this is pulling directly into an Excel formula a value from my cube. Bit meaningless because this is the stock price. I think this is the average stock price of every stock in my portfolio. So kind of not meaningful, but you can add different parameters into this. So going back to my formula, you can actually, if I press a comma here, I can add a slicer. So if I just start writing slicer, it's got my slices listed. These are the slices that I've added into my report. So maybe I want to see this specific industry. So I'm actually in the wrong Excel sheet, so I'm going to copy this because this is about stock price. I'm going to paste it here. So we see here, we've added slicer industry. This is the industry slicer. If I go to slicer settings, we can hear this is named to use in formula slicer industry, if you ever want to know which slicer you're referring to. Right. Now this formula is now responsive to the slicer. You see getting data. Now this changes with our slicer. Pretty cool. So we can use our formula directly linked to a slicer. If I wanted, for example, I say I don't want to see just the industry, that still doesn't make sense. I can just manually type in a specific field that I want to give this to. So I'm going to say I want the, I think it's, so if I start my quotations, it's going to give me a list of my different tables. My company list, I want to say I just want to look at Microsoft stock price. So I'm going to say company list, and then each parameter is separated by full stop. So company list, so this is the table name, dot symbol, dot, and now it's going to prompt me for all. I'm actually just going to type in square brackets, Microsoft symbol, MSFT. Oh, and then I have to end my quotations. So here's my formula. I've said the connection is the model. The measure is the stock price. And now I can pass in filters. I've said table name company, list, dot, field symbol, Microsoft. And now this is probably could do with some formatting, but this is a very precise value of the Microsoft stock to many decimal places. These formulas are really useful. You know, if you have people writing formulas who are familiar with them, I'd probably want to put extra formulas like a date range in this, because I think this is the monthly average over 10 years. Probably not the best stat, but you know, you can have this obviously as a field, as Excel people like to do wonderful things in Excel. You can do that. The other one we had, I think this was Point, which is great. If you go to click on your pivot table, you go to pivot table analyze, and we go to Olap tools. We can then just convert to formulas. We built this pivot table. This is going to automatically do all that formula for us. This was a very large pivot table, so it might take a while. It's slower, obviously. And again, that's the point. The more flexibility, the more changes we want to make, kind of the slower, the harder it's going to be. But now we can see it's written these formulas for us. So it's actually used cube member because this is the dimension. And this is the cube value that is written for us. So it's saying this model. And now because it's referring to cube member formulas, it's just saying referring to this pivot table, the values directly, and then the slices that's affecting it. This can get really complicated, as you can see, the formulas get quite complicated. So this converter formulas is a way, if you want to make slight edits and make the formulas yourself, to get it outside of that pivot table. If you want this, again, these formulas are live connected through that connection from to your model. So I open up this tomorrow. If I've refreshed the data, these could be different values, which is really good. So a question?
A trick I've used on this one, sometimes there's very specific formatting you want, or you want values to stay 0 when they're not selected. When you go turn everything into cube values, if it can't return a value for the cube value, it just drops into 0, or something that's blank, or you can start putting some formatting things around it. So you can have, you know, I need a specific list of these 10 things. I don't care what you select, it should always be this list of 10 things. I've seen that before. So in Power BI, typically it's harder to do that because there's values that show up when the data is there and they disappear when data is not there. It's trying to make it more efficient for you. Here, when you're using this, you actually have a bit more control around the formatting of how you want the data presented in a very specific way. So this gives you that same global data model standpoint, but you can then format to your heart's content.
This could be exceedingly expensive though on your analysis services, right?
No more than you do in Power BI. Every time you click on something in Power BI, every bar, it's still firing off as many queries, 20 queries or so per page, depending on how much stuff you have. So,
But
I mean,
now you're talking about a query for each one of those cells.
When you convert to formulas,
Right, when you convert to formulas.
yeah, and you saw how long it took. I probably wouldn't recommend that on like a pivot table like that. If you're using formulas, I would say use it to get measures directly. When you have the pivot table, you can see when I go to the Olap extensions, you can see kind of the query it's sending off. But yeah, it's not. It would be more expensive with the formulas. So formulas are a great way to get bigger level metrics, I think. You want today's stock price of your company, something like that, or today's sales, and you have that.
This isn't a big deal if you're 5 people all hitting a cube. This is probably a big deal if you have 20,000 people hitting.
but I would recommend not sharing Excel files. I mean, there's thresholds here. This is like your analyst, financial person that's got to, you know, write their C-level executive report every month, right? This is a good use case for them. This is not a good use case for just democratizing an Excel report to 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that would be your best use case there.
Yeah, again,
push you more towards, probably should be thinking about a Power BI report instead.
Yeah.
That's made for that kind of audience.
Again, this probably isn't a huge enterprise solution. I think I said at the beginning. Situations for different people. I would say I would use this more. You know, we have the few people in finance who are still wanting their Excel. We have the people, smaller companies who are taking on adoption, who who aren't quite into that Excel yet, who don't quite know it. Yeah, and especially for finance teams, because I feel they're getting to Power BI. Still, in my experience, a lot of people still love.
This has turned a lot of finance teams for me. I mean, this is showing them this and just doing this with them a couple times. Like, oh my gosh, I'm back where I'm happy. And then after they play with this for a bit, then they start, well, what Power BI can do for me? And then they start thinking about, okay, let's start merging myself onto more of the Power BI things. And oh wow, this is way more powerful. This is doing other things that I want to do. So there's actually it's kind of a good. We said earlier, like, it's like your gateway entrance to using Power BI more in different areas.
Everyone's not insured.
Yeah,
just different entry points.